Motörhead is one of the best bands of all time across all music. From Beethoven to whatever the hell a Jelly Roll is, Motörhead dominates them all. Modern day chart toppers and social media stars are empty, and again, Motörhead dominates them all. If you disagree, you have horrible tastes. Just an objective fact.
Okay. My name is Lemmy Kilmister and I claim my prize. Who doesn't like rock and roll? Hey, rock and roll's dead. They said that in 1957, yeah? They were wrong then too. Young kids playing stuff that their parents hated, which was great, That's how it should be.
Have you any message to the audience for today?
Yeah, believe in rock and roll. That is the only religion that never lets you down.
We are Motörhead! And we play rock and roll!
Over the course of heavy metal's illustrious and complex evolution, a few acts stand to serve as foundational characters. From Black Sabbath's Children of the Grave serving to introduce a generation of headbangers to the rolling gallop of riffage itself, to Iron Maiden and Steve Harris taking it to stratospheric levels. While there are plenty of bands I could name and expound upon, for me there is one that sits firmly on the throne at the pillar of rock history once pioneered by the likes of Elvis Presley and the Beatles, Motörhead. Few bands and figures stand out as inarguable foundations of the genre and all of the subgenres that spawn from it, and at its very core, heavy metal is built on top of rock and roll. And of the notable figures, Lemmy Kilmister is by far the purest spirit of rock and roll as it applies to heavy metal, though he adamantly stood outside of the label and genre itself. He was the perfect rock star blueprint and is one of pop culture's most interesting people, whether you're a fan of Motörhead or not. They laid the groundwork and were integral to everything that came after them, and the man behind it all stood to serve as a legend for nearly his entire career. From his humble beginnings to his blazing and speed-fueled triumphs, to his unfortunate but not unlikely final days. Lemmy continues to be an inspiration for not only the generations that were lucky enough to have him, but for every generation that will spawn in the coming years. Today, I aim to pay tribute and tell somewhat of a cohesive collection of stories about a man and his band as it applied to heavy metal, in a bid to pay my respects tangibly. Lemmy is an icon to many and a hero to some, and to me, he and Motörhead helped shape my interest in music in a way that I feel extremely grateful to have had installed in the software of my brain. Whether or not his rough lifestyle is one to emulate, his legacy is certainly one envied by many bands and figures, and few frontmen in rock music even come close to his impact, while plenty of them had the honor of calling him a friend. They were Motörhead and they played rock and roll, so make sure you're sufficiently intoxicated and you have the volume turned up to 11. This is a tribute history to Lemmy Kilmister and Motörhead. Ian Fraiser Kilmister was born December 24th, 1945 in Stoke-on-Trent, England, just 3 months after the official end of World War II. The entire world had entered a completely new reality with the creation and deployment of the nuclear bomb, and the war left much of Europe in rubble and disarray. It left the once dominant country of England in a politically tough spot, and a need for physical reconstruction would be a Goliathan task. They had a lot going on, and most of it wasn't great, and that was the world a young Ian Kilmister would grow up in. The mythology behind Kilmister's immortalized moniker would begin in his childhood. From a young age, he was a bit of a deviant with finances, constantly asking around for a pence or two among the surrounding population. Lemmy a quid, if you will. It's a name that would stick, and I'm not sure has any official origin, but what is a fact is that if I say it, you know exactly who I'm talking about. You know, like if I said Carl, you probably wouldn't have any idea. I don't even know if I know anyone named Carl. In true rockstar fashion, I need to stress that this isn't a definitive story. It's circulated and accepted by many, but Lemmy himself has said that he doesn't really remember exactly how it was stuck to him, but it did, and it's historical. His father would leave early into his life, and he was raised by his library clerk mother and grandmother. He didn't pay much mind to academic pursuits growing up, but growing up right alongside him was rock and roll, something that would capture his attention very early on, being introduced to American rock artists by his stepfather. As the 1950s approached, much like in the United States, we began to see the youth movements and the literal birth of the teenager right as Lemmy was entering his adolescence. As it did in parallel with the US, these not quite kids but not yet adult figures would take the reins of popular culture, mainly in the realm of music. With the birth of rock and roll in the United States, with its foundation in blues and rebellion, it would be the single greatest export the states have ever produced. You ask me anyway. Elvis Presley, Chuck Berry, and an array of others would take over American pop culture and go on to heavily influence many of the UK's future wave of rock and roll acts, Lemmy especially. After noticing a classmate with a guitar surrounded by girls, he brought his mother's old guitar to school and was then himself surrounded by chicks, even though he had no idea how to play it. As the 1950s progressed and a recovering Britain saw its own youth movement, we saw the formation of groups like the Rolling Stones and the Beatles becoming a big hit in the 1960s. And with the Beatles' first appearance on the Ed Sullivan Show in the US, it would kick off the British invasion as the UK's contribution to rock and roll continued to grow, beginning a back and forth that we've been engaged in ever since as far as rock music evolution goes. With England's answer to American rock and roll beginning to take shape and take over not only the UK but the rest of the West, it would spark inspiration in many of the country's later figures like Ozzy Osbourne and Black Sabbath, but most notably for today, Lemmy and his venture into music.
If there was a band that you saw at a moment where where like there was a moment where you said, this is what I know I want to do.
In his teenage years, Lemmy's naturally rebellious nature would push him away from the schooling and into local bands. He would go on to work odd jobs here and there, but it was music he was looking to pursue. After seeing the Beatles perform in Liverpool when he was 16, he picked up a guitar and taught himself to play by learning their tunes. He was hungry to be on stage and work with an act, and as 1965 approached, he would join the Rockin' Vickers, going on to tour the UK and other European countries. His tenure with them wouldn't produce much traction, and just 2 years later he would depart. In the time leading up to his first notable break, he did everything from playing with bands to being a roadie for Jimi Hendrix. Among other jobs he did for the psychedelic icon, he would even get a bit of foreshadowing from Hendrix, who told Lemmy he'd never be a great guitar player. As he sits in the history books as one of rock music's most iconic bass players, many people don't know that he wasn't a bass player at all, at least not until 1971, when he would seize an opportunity to fill the bassist position for space rock outfit HawKNLoaD after the band's previously recruited bassist failed to show up to a gig. Lemmy's iconic bass tone would be crafted here with HawKNLoaD, and he would go on to serve a role with vocals for some of the band's arrangements as well. Lemmy had a penchant for living life on the edge, especially during his time with HawKNLoaD, where mind-altering experiences were part of the band's ethos. Well, everyone did, especially a psychedelic space rock group like HawKNLoaD, but what things would ultimately come down to is what everyone was into. While a lot of downers and psychedelics would be preferable to his bandmates, Lemmy liked to go fast, speed freak style. As a rebellious spirit forged in rock and roll, it would lead to some proclivities that got under the skin of his HawKNLoaD cohorts. While on tour in 1975 and attempting to enter the United States from Canada, they would be stopped at the border after Lemmy's stash of amphetamines was discovered and he was arrested, prompting HawKNLoaD to unceremoniously expel their speedy bassist, leaving him there to fend for himself. In return, Lemmy would take the final song he wrote for the band and use it to organize his own outfit, a perfectly fitting term for his vices, his spirit, and the situation leading to his expulsion: Motörhead. As the blues rock of the 1970s began to evolve into heavy metal, bands like Black Sabbath would set a firm foundation for the genre's creation. The 1970s saw an arguably bigger explosion of heavy metal than it would see in the 1980s, and rock and roll was now sharing a space with bands like Iron Maiden and Judas Priest, and punk rock royalty like the Ramones, all of which would be important to where heavy metal ended up. But with Motörhead, genres are ultimately meaningless because the true spirit of Lemmy's new outfit was simply rock and roll. But his classmates in this new era of rock music would play an important part. Alongside Motörhead and as Lemmy established his band, an important movement would develop with or right alongside them, depending on who you ask. The new wave of British heavy metal is a moment in time more so than a genre of music. It was comprised of an array of experimental and genius metal bands like Venom, Diamond Head, Saxon, and many more that often fail to get the credit they deserve. While Motörhead wasn't technically part of this new wave of British heavy metal, they were one of its biggest influences. The band's relentless speed and raw sound would lend inspiration to bands like Iron Maiden and Saxon. Lemmy always insisted Motörhead was rock and roll, but their influence on the heavier, faster side of British music is undeniable, inarguable, and essential to the development of everything that followed them. They're essential when weighing the history that would be laid out in the 1980s with bands like Metallica and Slayer, as well as the glam metal movement that ran right alongside it, helmed by bands like Motley Crue. The explosion of talent that would find its way onto tapes and vinyl records, only to be shipped across the pond to the bedroom of Lars Ulrich and Jeff Hanneman, would at the very least accent Lemmy's efforts. But I'm skipping ahead a bit. Rewinding back to 1975, we find an abandoned Lemmy sitting at the border of the United States and Canada, looking for nothing but rock and roll. And if he can't find that with someone else's band, he's gonna set off to do it himself. His speedy proclivities extended to his preferred sound and style, with him wanting it to be, quote, loud, fast, city raucous, arrogant, paranoid, speed freak rock and roll. It'll be so loud that if we moved in next door to you, your lawn would die. Motörhead's first lineup would see it as a trio act, with Larry Wallace on guitar and Lucas Fox on drums. They would be contracted thanks to Lemmy's former HawKNLoaD connections and set up to rehearse and record their first of many releases. But as they geared up to do so, Lucas Fox would prove to be unreliable, and Lemmy would recruit an acquaintance that he would see around here and there who told him that he played the drums, but Lemmy had never heard him do so. That acquaintance would be one Filthy Animal Taylor. They would even take their first shot at an album with On Parole, but the label was so dissatisfied with the record that it would be shelved, eventually being released years later after Motörhead broke through as a success. In the band's early days, it would take some time for them to build an audience. In fact, Lemmy's iconic microphone placement, sky high and powerful, served both the purpose of comfort and spared Lemmy from seeing the crowd, which back then was simply 10 blokes and a dog. The band would audition a second guitarist as well, auditioning and recruiting Fast Eddie Clarke, seeing existing guitarist Larry Wallace quit immediately afterward. And with this new trio lineup, all of Motörhead's most important pieces would be in place, ready to show the world the loudest rock and roll in existence. But recording contract politics and an unstable state with the personnel, their legendary Golden Age lineup would be extremely shaky as they worked to find their footing. It was enough for Clarke and Taylor to decide to call it quits, but agreed to a final round of shows as a farewell. It was at one of these shows that they would be approached by an executive and offered 2 days in a studio to record a single. That single would turn into 13 tracks total after a few days in the studio. And at this stage, they had a record ready for release. Their self-titled single would be the first release of the bunch, leading up to their self-titled album launch a few months later, finally establishing their first official album release. For the cover of the album, they would recruit an artist to craft Snaggletooth, the iconic artwork synonymous with Motörhead and easily one of the most recognizable logos in music history. They would even go on to support that album on tour, opening for Lemmy's previous band, HawKNLoaD, in a fitting full-circle story. And while Motörhead's first record is a great one, their follow-ups are some of the most important albums in hard rock and heavy metal history, all with their pure, unleaded rock and roll. They would score a one-off single deal releasing a cover of Louie Louie, one of my all-time favorite Motörhead tracks, a track that would chart well in the UK, further establishing Motörhead's reputation. In March of 1979, they would release their next album, Overkill, which would become a breakthrough release for the band, kicking off the golden age of Motörhead proper, at least to many fans looking back at the time. They would tour in support and begin the cycle of writing the follow-up, Bomber, and by the dawn of the 1980s, they were an established act, already influencing the UK and abroad, but it would all lead up to their single biggest release, cementing the band and Lemmy's legacy. They had a proven formula of rock and roll that worked and worked well and would continue to work with the release of Ace of Spades. A collection of gambler tropes and the signature Motörhead sound would result in the band's highest charting hit, taking Motörhead from no one to Titanic legends in a short 5 years. As it all coincided with the new wave of British heavy metal, Motörhead and the UK would see a massive movement catching on with young metalheads in the United States. They would be massive inspirations for garage bands across the world that would become peers in a few short years. The 1980s were looking amazing for heavy metal, and Motörhead had an essential hand in that.
Do you get mad if a band copies your style?
No. Good luck to them. Maybe they'll do something we can copy later.
The 1980s would see the birth and an explosion of heavy metal subgenres. From thrash metal to death metal to everything in between, under, over, and on top. For heavy metal specifically, it was arguably the genre's most prolific decade, outshining even the growth it saw in the 1970s. A major part of that goes overlooked, but is proselytized by many like myself, was Motörhead. From directly influencing the attitude and sound of the Bay Area thrash titans to everyone else, you'd be hard-pressed to find anyone worth talking about from the time period who didn't love Motörhead. In those early days, bands like Metallica were just another collection of hungry kids, but Lemmy's fast and unapologetic style struck a chord with them. They saw in Lemmy a model for defying musical norms and putting speed and attitude above everything else, helping to shape Metallica's thrash metal identity and, in turn, branching off an arm of heavy metal that would eventually rule the world. Lemmy and the band would kick off the 1980s by riding the wave of 1979's Overkill, one of the most revered records that they've ever put out. But their breakout release would come at the start of the decade with Ace of Spades. The legendary album and its title track would see Lemmy throwing together as many gambler tropes as he could think up, and it would be a smash hit, marking what would go on to be Motörhead's defining release. It would be the third in a trilogy of breakout albums, establishing Motörhead as a dominant force in heavy metal, although Lemmy himself would say it was all just rock and roll. Despite separating himself from the heavy metal label, there's no denying the impact that he would have on it, and for all the people firing up comments to argue about it, there you go. I know he didn't own the genre labeling, so I'm talking about Motörhead in the context of metal, and am clearly and concisely adhering to the wishes of Lemmy, the God, by stating that Motörhead is a rock and roll band. The distinction seemed important to him, so it's important to me. An evolution, however slight, in Motörhead's sound would be noticeable in 1982's Iron Fist, a self-produced classic in its own right, and they would trek on, keeping true to being the loudest band in the land. With the evolving landscape that hard rock and heavy metal were experiencing during this time, Motörhead was very much a foundational force for it. The musical evolution would continue with Orgasmatron, arguably the most metal of the band's discography. The Golden Age lineup would see its end after Lemmy participated in a collaboration with Plasmatics vocalist Wendy O. Williams, covering Stand By Your Man, a track originally recorded by Tammy Wynette. Fast Eddie Clarke would feel that the song and Motörhead's participation was compromising the band's principles. But according to Filthy Animal Taylor in later interviews, there was much more to their tensions than simply this cover song. Lemmy appeared to be upset with Clarke's production on their Iron Fist record. It was a situation that would end with Clarke's resignation, and he would go on to form his own outfit as Motörhead continued on. There would be another personnel change in a long history of personnel changes, but is arguably one of the most impactful to the band's history. Seeking a new guitarist would ultimately find the band back to being a quartet, with the recruiting of Phil Campbell and Wurzel, a pair of previously lesser-known guitarists. Campbell would ultimately be a pillar of Motörhead along with Lemmy, holding his position for the next 30 years. Taylor would quit the band soon after as the band trekked on to continue productions and touring. In the history books, Filthy Animal Taylor would serve as the band's skin basher from 1975 to 1984 and return for a run between 1987 and 1992. Swedish drummer Mickey D, formerly of King Diamond's opening run of solo records, would join the band in the early 90s, and much like Campbell, would serve in that position until the band's end in 2015. Rolling back a bit, by the end of the 1980s, they had 9 studio records under their belt, and a slew of other releases right alongside it. They would finalize the decade with Rock and Roll in 1987, and their third live record, No Sleep at All, the following year, and were firmly planted in the history books as one of the greatest to ever do it.
That was always the message of rock, is rebellion.
Yeah.
Shit that pisses your parents off, you know.
Supposed to
Turn
be.
that noise down, you know, then you know you got it right.
Well before we reached the 1990s, Lemmy had a solidified legacy and legend surrounding him. He was down to earth and approachable by nearly everyone. He was revered for the awesome music he helped to create, and he was a mythological figure as much then as he is now. Motörhead would open up the decade with 1916, yet another great record if you're looking to expand beyond the classic. The 1990s would see more of the same, with Lemmy and Motörhead being at home on stage, serving up severe tinnitus to a crowd of maniacs eager to receive it. Lemmy would contribute to tracks and lyrics for Ozzy Osbourne's mega hit No More Tears, and would remain a close friend to his fellow Titanic peer. He would contribute lyrics and music with credits to 4 songs on the record: Hellraiser, I Don't Want to Change the World, Mama I'm Coming Home, and Desire. He would make a cameo appearance in Airheads, a headbanger cult classic movie about a struggling LA band taking a radio station hostage with water guns to get airtime, and starred a prime Brendan Fraser, Steve Buscemi, and Adam Sandler, but I probably don't need to be telling you that.
Who'd win in a wrestling match, Lemmy or God?
Lemmy. God.
Wrong, dickhead. Trick question. Lemmy is God.
In 1995, for Lemmy's 50th birthday, an all-out celebration would be held featuring a number of major acts, most notably Metallica. They would all dress up as the man of the hour and perform a set of Motörhead tunes on stage as the Lemmys. The rehearsals for that show would be recorded and later appear on Metallica's mega covers album Garage Incorporated, netting Lemmy the biggest payday he ever had. Metallica's tribute didn't end there. Releasing those cover tracks on Garage Incorporated ensured that Lemmy's influence was etched into their legacy. For Metallica, Lemmy was more than a musician, he was part of the family and a lifelong influence, something that they clearly wanted the entire world to know. See, while he was rich in love and notoriety, it never really amounted to any lavish rock star lifestyle, in part because he never yearned for one, but also because he didn't make much from it. He lived in a rent-controlled apartment in LA next to his favorite bar, the Rainbow, where you could find him when he wasn't out on tour, or scouting out and collecting World War II memorabilia and artifacts, to put it in a way that people aren't going to freak out over. Of Lemmy and Motörhead's most notable 90s contributions would be their foray into professional wrestling. While the WWE was looking to revamp top card star Triple H's entrance music, Hunter Hearst Helmsley, real name Paul Levesque, they would direct Jim Johnston and their music department to make it sound like Motörhead. Triple H is one of pro wrestling's most iconic metalheads, and as a massive fan of Lemmy, he felt it would fit perfectly with him for his return to the ring. When they failed to get the sound quite right for his liking, he simply suggested they ask Lemmy themselves. It was an offer the band would accept, and Triple H's The Game theme song would go on to be one of WWE's most iconic entrance themes. Lemmy and Motörhead would contribute more to Triple H, with King of Kings and Line in the Sand as the superstar progressed throughout his career, now running the show himself after the ousting of Vince McMahon. I had to do all that because WWE is pretty heavy-handed with the copyright claiming. Here. I shouldn't have done that. As the Icons progressed through the 1990s, they would ultimately release 6 albums in total between 1991 and 1998 before entering the new millennium. It would be a tumultuous time, with their lineup seeing plenty of change, though Lemmy, ever the pillar of rock and roll himself, would absolutely put his nose to the grindstone. And the amphetamines. By the year 2000, Lemmy and Motörhead were well-established legends, and while they wouldn't hang up their hat anytime soon, they would ride out the years in the studio and on the road. In 2004, Foo Fighters frontman and Nirvana legend Dave Grohl would bring some heavy metal material that he had been writing for years into the studio for a one-off release dubbed Probot. He would recruit an array of metal's finest to help make the album the cult classic it is in the present day, including Lemmy for the single Shake Your Blood. It would be accompanied by a music video and would be a great example of the close friendship between Grohl and Kilmister, going on to be one of the coolest things Dave has ever done, and he's done a ton of cool things. Dave Grohl is just awesome. In 2010, filmmakers Greg Oliver and Wes Orshowski set out to capture the true Lemmy experience with an all-access documentary titled, well, Lemmy. It would feature a star-studded cast of heavy metal greats, all inspired by the man himself. From James Hetfield to the previously fawned over Dave Grohl, it would take a look at the life and day-to-day of Lemmy Kilmister as he spent time at his favorite watering hole, the Rainbow Bar and Grill in Los Angeles, California, and took a look into his humble abode, a rent-controlled apartment right next door filled to the gills with video games and World War II relics. He collected a ton of National Socialist items, back when it was easier to explain why someone would own those things, while also acknowledging how awful those who utilized them were. Lemmy in no way shared any views that could even be remotely connected to them. I just wanted to make that clear for the comments section. In total, Motörhead would release 22 albums, 16 live records, 5 EPs, bookending one of the greatest careers in rock music. Lemmy was a certified Mount Rushmore level icon to the movement of rock music and heavy metal in a way that very few figures can lay claim to. And while it didn't make him a wealthy man, at least not in dollars, he lived exactly as he wanted to, in an unleaded and pure spirit of rock and roll way. It was a legendary existence that inspired, infected, and erected all of the hard rock and heavy metal genres that followed in their wake. It would result in Lemmy Kilmister being inarguably immortalized in a way that I like to think he was satisfied with, and in the post-apocalyptic end times, Motörhead will be there, inspiring movements as they always have. It was a career and a life that would ultimately catch up to Lemmy in 2015. Sudden health struggles would prompt him to see a doctor. He would pass away just 2 days after being diagnosed with an aggressive cancer. It was extremely sudden but unsurprising, coming less than a month after the band's final performance in Germany. It was quick, which in retrospect is quite fitting for a legend that spent his whole life as fast and loud as possible. A funeral would be held to honor the icon, attended by droves of the very legends he inspired, from Triple H to Dave Grohl. It left the metal world in mourning and everyone's ears ringing in tribute. It would be the bookend on a life that no other human on Earth has ever or will ever live, and it left an unyielding legacy of decibel levels barely comprehensible by the millions he inspired. It was a life lived hard, fast, and loud, and to be entirely honest, making it to 70 was proof that there is a God, and he's a Motörhead fan. It's a shame that a God so noble had to step down once Lemmy reached the pearly gates. A fate befitting a man that never slowed down, seeing the icon continuing to tour the world and find multiple resting places. The Lemmy Forever project, organized by Motörhead's management, sees Foreverance, a company specializing in customized tributes, have fashioned an urn perfectly encapsulating the legend, and portions of Lemmy's ashes sit at his favorite locations, like the Rainbow in California or Stringfellows nightclub, Lemmy's favorite London strip joint, along with a few other places. The urns and their tribute are just another in a long line of commemorations. There's only so many ways to call the man a legend, and everyone has and continues to do so.
Black flag. So I walked up and I said, "Excuse me, Lemmy, I don't want to bother you, but you've influenced me so much. You're my musical hero. I'm a musician. I play in the Foo Fighters, and I was in Nirvana." And he looked up from the video game, and the first thing he ever said to me, he said, "Hey, I'm sorry about what happened to your friend."
Motörhead has been one of the more positive forces in my life, as an art form that has not only connected to my innate love for rock and roll, which I believe may even be the reason for it. Motörhead has helped shape not only the music that I love, but in some outwardly visual ways, the way that I am. Obviously, Lemmy is a hero of mine, whether you feel his lifestyle is one to admire or not. His art and attitude are unmatched, and his contribution to rock music would take more time to plot out than I think you'd be willing to put up with me. From the minute he picked up a guitar for the first time, to the last cigarette he smoked on his deathbed. Few figures in music and pop culture have managed to immortalize themselves in the same way as Lemmy Kilmister. To completely trek through his life, event by event, would take ages and is kind of something that I do in pieces at least, but it's a thorough lesson in being yourself and doing whatever you want. It not only worked out for Lemmy, depending on how you look at it, but contributed to some of the greatest art we've managed to create as a species, all with a simple formula of fast, loud, and free. Smoke 'em if you got 'em and break out the Jack Daniels for a man who helped build a major cornerstone of the music we all love to gather around and represent to the public. A public that would be left with contorted looks and ringing ears if you're doing it the right way. Lemmy and Motörhead are nearly one and the same. They left behind a catalog of wonders for the world to enjoy until the wheels fell off. It will be one of the deepest cutting regrets of my short, useless life that I failed to stand among a crowd of strangers that suddenly became family as Lemmy snuffed out his cigarette, chunked his loud, distorted bass guitar, and exclaimed the words that clearly meant to encompass everyone in attendance.
We are Motörhead, and we play rock and roll.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you once again for letting me tell you another story. Production took a little longer than I anticipated, but I recently started an awesome new job, so we're back in black, boys. This is another personally satisfying video to have in the books, even if I grow to hate it a week after it comes out like I do with most of the others, but it's a tribute that I hope lives up to a fraction of the respect that it was meant to serve. You guys, particularly the ones that make it this far into the longer projects, are my most dedicated supporters, and I really can't thank you enough for giving my annoying voice and cliche appearance the time of day. While I am certainly not alone, one of the driving forces behind this entire process is the cutting realization that I missed out. I wasn't around to see the magic, and there's nothing I can do about it except honor these bands and icons by making sure someone hears the story. I am a bard singing of adventures and exploits that I will never participate in for a small pub full of misfit netizens that might perk up when they hear it. If you want more heavy metal and hard rock history, news, and commentary, I post daily shorts right here on the channel, so make sure you're subscribed. Notifications optional. And if you're hungry for more, there is literally hours of content going back a few years now. If you want to support even further, check out the Patreon or become a member and get early access, exclusive updates, and anything else I can come up with. And if you do wander over there, thank you. I know this video comes after a long break as I've been working pretty heavy overtime and my weekends are occupied with the shorter content. We're sticking to rock and roll from this point forward, which seems stupid for me to say out loud, but the few have spoken and I shall deliver. And thank you as always for making it to the end of another HawKNLoaD ramble. Catch you guys in the next video and every afternoon for those shorts that I mentioned.